Hi there, everybody. Good to see y'all, everyone from LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube here today. If y'all are coming from all around the world, go ahead and put where you're coming from in chat. I'd love to see it. Always gets me excited when I'm talking to folks from all the way around the world. I'm in Denver myself, so I'd love to see that if you guys have time. I'd also love to know, obviously, what we're going to talk about today while we wait for everybody to filter in. What we're going to talk about today is migrations and how to avoid the pitfalls and the worry and the stress that comes with a poor migration strategy. So I'm curious if anyone here has had experiences with poor migration in the past, and what really your experience was. If you have a brief story, you feel free to type it into chat. We're just going to give people a couple of seconds to join in here. But yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to do this presentation is I work as a solution engineer here at DigitalOcean. I work with a lot of customers who have struggled with a migration plan in the past. DigitalOcean always recommends customers use a multi-cloud strategy. It's good for disaster recovery. It's good for multiple reasons, cost savings. You can change the footprint of your infrastructure based on what is most cost effective for you and most performant. So migrations are a key part of that. You have to understand how to move parts of your infrastructure. Yeah, so Bradley said lift and shift. SSL was like, nah, fam, and DNS was in strange places. Yeah, my favorite haiku is, I'm going to get this wrong now that I'm saying it live, but it can't be DNS. It's never DNS. It can't be DNS. It was DNS, right? It's always DNS when you don't expect it to be. So, and even when you do expect it, sometimes that's a problem, which is why we'll talk about DNS specifically in this presentation. It's something you got to prep for. Hey, from the Netherlands. That's awesome. We actually have some folks in the Netherlands who work at DigitalOcean, so several people. And Indonesia. Wow, all around the world. That's great. It has to be DNS. Exactly. I agree, Bradley. DNS is a huge problem for migrations, which is why we'll talk specifically about TTLs today. But awesome. And then we got some folks from India. We've got a huge team in India. I love our India folks. I helped train a lot of our support staff over there back in the day when DigitalOcean was still a young company. So, hey, hello Sweden. Hello Krister Svensson. Very nice to see you. Oh, Kazakhstan. That's a first for me. That's great. And Bangladesh. All right. Well, we got people from all over. Very nice to have you folks here today. Obviously, my name is Darian Wilkin. I'm with DigitalOcean. I'm a solutions engineer, which means that typically my job is to work with customers of DigitalOcean who are trying to figure out how to do things the right way in the cloud, best practices, building high availability and redundancy, and making sure that their applications are up and working, and that they understand exactly how to operate them most effectively. So migrations are something that come up quite a bit when we're talking about that, because they are critical to any active cloud deployment. You can't just be expecting to sit in one place. Even if you're not migrating between clouds, you can migrate between regions, and that oftentimes requires a lot of these same principles be observed. But multi-cloud strategies are the way of the future. It's best for disaster recovery and things like that. So it's always good to have an idea of how to do those things. And this is what we're going to talk about today, is how you can most effectively plan for and execute a migration. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about some key terms first. Then we're going to talk about the migration preparation phase. And to be honest, that's the bulk of the work here, right? Anybody who's ever completed a successful migration, I apologize, I was supposed to tell when we were starting our slide deck here. So the first things we're going to talk about today are the migration prep. Key terms in migration prep. The bulk of the work is the migration prep. That there's three types of migration we're going to talk about briefly. We're going to talk about how diagrams are important for a migration planning phase, and then talking about how simplifying your migration can sometimes be the right thing to do. Then we're going to talk about what the migration timeline is going to look like. and we are going to talk about executing that migration. This is Sammy here. If anybody hasn't met Sammy before, Sammy is DigitalOcean's mascot, and he'll make a couple appearances throughout this slide deck. Great. So let's talk about some key terms. I know these are basic terms. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about these later on in the presentation. Don't want anybody getting confused. Migration is moving code and state from one physical location to another, right? Now, what are code and state? Code is the stuff you don't change, that doesn't change unless you deploy something new. This is your immutable infrastructure. This is stuff that deploys straight from GitHub, right? State, on the other hand, is the data your application creates as it runs. It's customer accounts, uploaded photos, product descriptions, anything that wasn't put in your version control system essentially is state. That's a good way to think about it. Read-only means a service can still respond to requests for data, but it can't make changes to its data set. This is a very useful feature for when we're doing a migration of a stateful service like a database, because it allows us to keep the site up in most of its functioning contexts, but still perform a migration without losing any state. We'll talk more about that later. Latency is the time it takes for packets to traverse the internet between physical machines, right? So that's just, I just want to make sure we're clear on all of those terms meaning the same thing. Now, you may know these as different words. That's okay. I just wanted to use the same terminology throughout this presentation. So, what is a migration? This is what a migration oftentimes feels like, right? We've got the golden idol. That's the successful migration, and we're trying to take this little bag of sand and guess and measure and pour out just enough so that it weighs exactly the same, and we can escape the Temple of Doom without dying. Well, this is a bad way to think about migrations. This is a way that is, thank you, Tasneem, sorry, I pronounced it wrong. This is a bad way to think about migrations, right? Because this is the way that a lot of people do it. That doesn't mean it's the right way to do it, right? This is a migration without planning. This is a migration where you don't understand how all the pieces fit together and you don't have a rollback plan, right? There's no going back from this once you've replaced the golden idol. You just hope that it worked, right? That's a bad way to think about things. So we want to get away from that. And how do we get away from that? We get away from it with detailed planning. And I know that's the last thing a developer wants to hear. Oh, I have to plan things in advance. But I assure you, it's the way to keep yourself stress-free when you're doing this stuff. So there are 4 basic steps that we want to think about when we're preparing for a migration, right? So the first is building an architecture diagram. Why do we want to build an architecture diagram? There are a few key reasons. One, we want to understand where our state is in our application. You may think you know, but until you've talked to your entire team and you've all built it out together, you don't know. You may be surprised what has state in it and what doesn't. What's sensitive to downtime, right? I know that seems like a weird question. Isn't everything sensitive to downtime? No, actually. There are some services, maybe a batch processing server, maybe a tertiary log aggregator service. Those aren't as sensitive to downtime during a migration as something like your web front end, right? So it's important to distinguish between what we have to migrate live and what we can migrate maybe offline or at a later time. And then finally, what is sensitive to latency, right? Again, with the yes, Bradley, the slide deck will be available later. It's going to be available to the public, so it'll be posted. So please check that out. And there are going to be plenty of lists here, so I understand you're going to want to look at the slide deck later. What is sensitive to latency? Why is that important? Because believe it or not, we don't have to migrate everything all at once, right? There are services that we can leave at one location. You're welcome, Bradley. There are services that we can leave at one location and potentially migrate later on because they're not sensitive to latency, right? So that's something we want to consider is, can we leave something behind to simplify our existing migration? We'll talk about that in a minute here. Step 2, and this is the bulk of the work of the migration, in my mind, is the migration dry run, right? Or dry runs, as it says on this slide, which is absolutely the case. If you have a successful dry run on your first try, you're a legend. You're the first in the world. I'm amazed. I bow down to you. You're incredible. It's not typical that your first dry run is successful. So that's why we have them, right? Because we don't want that first dry run to be our migration, our actual migration, where we're having downtime and things like that, and then we find out the problems we had. Migration dry runs are critical to having a successful migration. We'll talk about exactly how to do those later on. But here are the things we're checking for. One, does everything work as expected on the new platform? And two, does your team have the skills and knowledge to complete that migration? You may be surprised. That's okay if they don't. Just means they have to learn. But if you ask them and don't have them try it out, they may tell you that they know how to do something that they really only have a fuzzy knowledge of, because they want to seem like they're the pro. So it's important to have these migration dry runs and have them be blameless learning experiences for the whole team. Step 3, or phase 3, I suppose, is the scheduling and notification, right? And this is a critical part that a lot of times gets overlooked because, hey, everybody on my team knows we're talking about this, right? We all know when it's going to happen. It doesn't, and we're the engineering team, so why would anybody else care? A lot of people care, right? We'll talk about exactly who that is later on, but the things you want to know are, how long is this migration going to take? What's your potential downtime window? Who needs to know, right? Most of your internal customers need to know, but do all of your external customers need to know? Maybe not for all services. And then finally, what's the best day and time, right? We don't want to schedule this at 5 o'clock on a Friday when everybody's off, because we may need to page some people in, and we don't want them to be 6 drinks in when we have to page them in, right? So we'll talk about that as well. Tuesday, by the way, that's the best day. In my mind, obviously this is all subjective, just Tuesday. Imminent preparation is the 4th phase here. And that's going to be where you're going to adjust your DNS TTLs, just like we were talking about at the beginning. That DNS stuff is critical to getting a successful migration done. So understanding that how to do that stuff right is important. And you're going to implement your code freeze in your imminent preparation. Code freeze. I didn't know there was going to be a code freeze involved with this. Yes, unfortunately, when we're moving stateless services, we have to ensure that the state isn't different on the different places, or we're going to have a mismatch, and we're going to have services that don't work properly together, or we're going to risk that, right? It's possible that you can go without any of this preparation and have a successful migration. It's also possible you can roll snake eyes 500 times in a row, right? It's not about what's possible, it's about what's safest and what's least risky. TTLs, great question. TTLs are time to live, okay? So time to live is a DNS term. DNS is obviously domain name services. This is your URL, right? So your URL points to an IP address. But there are DNS caching servers all around the world, and typically they only grab that address every 12 to 24 hours. And then they store it locally so it doesn't have to be asked again, right? Now, TTLs are important because if we have our TTL set to 12 hours, our time to live set to 12 hours, those caching servers are only going to grab it every 12 hours. If we're in the middle of a migration, we don't want to wait 12 hours for that to happen. So we want to adjust our TTLs proactively to 30 seconds. To make sure, or lower, right, whatever the lowest your provider allows, to 30 seconds or lower, so that we can make changes and very quickly see the results. And believe it or not, you have to adjust those TTLs 12 hours at least in advance, 24 hours at least in advance, to make sure that those new changes are picked up. And so Arian asked, how can we know the migration is completed as expected? Yeah, that's a good question. And that's one of the reasons we run so many dry runs, right? This is the dry run process involves unit testing, right? It involves sending requests to the servers, sending requests to those servers, and then getting the correct response. If we don't understand what responses our application should be sending on dry runs, then we can't perform a successful migration. We have to know, hey, this is the input we give, this is the output we expect, right? So that's a good question, Ariane, and it's something that you should develop in your migration dry run plan. So thanks for asking. Any other questions, guys? Feel free to shoot them out. I'll get to them if I can, if I see them. But I love the engagement, so please don't hesitate to ask and chat with each other in chat. No problem there. All right. So let's talk about the 3 types of migration. Okay. There's a live migration, there's a read-only migration, and there's an offline migration. And this is actually specifically talks about Jamal's question here in chat, which is how do you handle the state of the application during migration? This is it, right? These are the 3 ways you can migrate, and they all have differences based on how you're treating state, essentially, right? So the live migration, read-only migration, offline migration. There's another way to refer to these that I use, which is the no downtime migration, the no downtime migration, and then the no, there's going to be downtime migration. So what is the difference between these 3? So the live migration is a migration that involves never having rights turned off for any of your services. Okay, that means that services don't change for your end users at all during the migration. The migration is totally transparent to them. By that I mean they don't see anything happening in their front end, right? The things are changing in the back end, but nothing's happening in the front end. Live migrations are obviously the ideal. However, they're very specific to the technologies that you're making use of, right? So if the technology you use in your stack enables live migrations, enables you to have state in 2 different locations and switch it over cleanly, that's great. That's excellent, but it's not what we're gonna focus on today, because it's harder. It's much more complex to do a fully live migration than it is to do the second type of migration, the read-only migration. Read-only migrations are migrations where most services still function because they still can read from the stateful services, but they can't necessarily write to them all the time. Now, this gives your customers a quote-unquote downtime window, but they can still utilize many services. Obviously, it depends on your application whether or not that's useful or not, but read-only migrations are really the general ideal state, right? If you try for a live migration, you're going to have a lot of complexity. It's going to be tough. If you go for a read-only migration, it's a lot simpler, it's a lot cleaner, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Offline migrations, obviously probably the simplest way to do it, but it's going to cause the most downtime. You're going to have a period where your site is totally non-functional. They can't even they can't even log in, right? They can't see any of their data. They can't even see your front end for an offline migration. That's not a professional way to do a migration. We want to stay away from that. So again, we're going to focus on the middle one here, the read-only migration. So the diagram. This is an example of a diagram. Now, obviously, your diagram doesn't have to look like this. It doesn't even have to be this pretty. It doesn't have to even have arrows that look this nice, right? It just has to have the pieces of your application that work together, right? That talk to each other. You have to have a picture of your infrastructure before you start a migration to be successful. You can do a diagram like this with several free tools. There are some paid tools, Draw.io, Lucidchart, Visio, Glyphy, Miro. These are all great tools for this. You can use MS Paint if you'd like. It doesn't matter, right? The important thing, I've seen people do it in PowerPoint, right? The important thing is that you have an understanding, your team has an understanding of where the various pieces of your infrastructure sit, what they talk to, what they rely on, and specifically what's state and what's stateless. Okay, so what's code and what's state. Okay, this stuff that I've highlighted, generally code, right? So for our example, we're going to call this stuff all code. What do I mean by that? I mean, we don't store any data on any of these nodes, right? There may be a local cache or something like that, but that's not important. What's important is the only time that these services change is when we make a new deployment, right? So when we deploy a new search service or when we deploy a new web app front end, right? That's when these services change. Otherwise, they're just handling requests. They're directing queries. They're sending responses. They don't store anything locally. That's important for migration, right? It's important to understand which services don't have state because they're easier to migrate than stateful services. And in fact, we want to migrate them before we migrate stateful services so that we understand. Sorry, we want to migrate them before we migrate stateful services because the stateful services migration period is our downtime window. That's our read-only window, which we'll talk about later. So let's look at the stateful services in this. And we see these, right? So our database, our in-memory cache, our logging service, our spaces. Right. So difference between state and stateless, again, is just state is the stuff that writes to disk or writes to something, right? So the database is state, logging service is state. This is stuff that stores data. Stateless services, once again, services that do not store any data. Those are easier to migrate because they do not change on a day-to-day basis, right? Unless we deploy any change. So talking about these stateful services, we have the databases, we have logging services, we have object storage. It's important to understand which of these are first of all going to be migrated. For instance, we look at the object storage. Does that really need to be migrated right away? No, we'll talk about that in the next slide. But we're looking at DBAS, the databases, the logging service. These are stateful services that we need to understand how to turn them read-only. Right? Almost all stateful services have the ability to have reads shut off. That includes all databases. We want to understand how to turn those writes off, and then that helps us understand how to perform the migration later on. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Keeping it simple, there are a few basic questions you want to ask yourself when you're looking at a migration plan, because the fact is this is complex stuff, right? If you're looking at migrating your entire infrastructure all in one go, it can take a lot. It takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of effort. So there are questions you want to ask that can potentially simplify your migration. For example, can we wait to move services that aren't sensitive to latency? That's the spaces question, right? That's object storage, right? Say you have object storage on a provider and all your other stuff on that provider, you want to move off that provider. You don't have to move the object storage right away. That's probably CDN backed. It's available around the world. It's not super sensitive to which data center or which provider it's in. So you can wait to migrate that to simplify your overall migration, right? You can ask things like, is the state in the cache important, right? If you look at that red box there, the in-memory cache, that's just an example, but memory caches are state, but they don't necessarily have useful state. Now they may, depending on your application, but it's possible that you don't need that data, right? It's possible it's just session caches to make things slightly faster, and that'll repopulate on your new host. So something like the in-memory cache doesn't necessarily need to be migrated. Okay. Another question is, can services which don't face customers deal with more downtime safely, right? Can we potentially just take the logging service down during the actual migration instead of turning it read-only and then stand it back up on the new host? That may not be the right solution for you, but there are certain things you want to ask about that, right? For instance, maybe the upload service on your application doesn't need to be running 24/7, right? Potentially, you can have that down for longer. And hi, Miracle. And without much issue, without a problem, you can have certain services down. Maryland. I lived in Maryland at one point. To see you folks from Maryland. And then finally, I say all this, and then I have this last question here, right? Is it worthwhile to increase the complexity of our infrastructure to reduce the complexity of our migration? What do I mean by that? I mean, if you leave services split temporarily, then you're temporarily increasing the complexity of your stack, right? It makes it more difficult. You have to log into multiple providers. You have to configure maybe VPN gateways, things like that. Or VPC gateways, I should say, things like that. It could provide more complexity than it helps with the migration process, right? So that's a question you have to ask your team and understand your own application. Is it worthwhile for you to increase the complexity of your infrastructure to reduce the complexity of your migration? I'm sorry, that's a mouthful, but so let's talk about the timeline. 1 month before, at least, I should say, first of all, these are all rules of thumb, right? This is what I tell to my customers when I'm talking to them about when they should plan for things. But this is absolutely not a hard, fast rule. You may want to start this migration dry run planning 6 months before your migration, right? That's totally up to you. This is my basic guideline. This is really my minimum guideline. at least 1 month before, you should be starting your migration dry runs. That means running through the entire migration process minus a couple of key steps. And then you're going to fully test that new deployment once it's on that other provider. Like we talked about earlier, how do you know your migration was successful? You have dry run after dry run, right? And you only stop doing dry runs once you have nailed it to the wall. Once you know 100% you've got this, you don't need to do another dry run because you had no issues for the past 3 dry runs. It's all worked perfectly. It worked exactly as expected. That's when you can relax on the dry runs. Until then, dry run, right? Now, you see there's a question down at the bottom here, retain duplicate architecture? I didn't need to read it like that, but I wanted to. So this is a question that only your team can answer. At the beginning of the migration phase, you can keep your architecture built out on that second host if you'd like to. Now, why wouldn't you do that? Because that doubles your costs, right? Until the migration is complete, your costs are, you're paying for your existing infrastructure and your migration infrastructure. If you keep destroying the infrastructure on the new host after each successful dry run or unsuccessful dry run, then you aren't paying as much. So it's a cost thing. It's totally a cost thing, whether or not you want to keep that infrastructure up and keep using that, or if you want to destroy and recreate each time and recreate right before the actual migration. Just wanted to call that out. So once you got your successful migration dry runs completed, you're going to notify your internal users. Why do you wait until now to notify? Because the migration dry runs give you your timeline, give you your downtime window, give you your risks. You do need to notify your internal users, and you need to notify them in advance of your external users. Why? For example, customer success, right? Your success and support and sales team. They need to be able to talk to their customers ahead of time and say, hey, we're going to have this happening. They need to be ready for when that customer asks them, hey, what's this migration notification I received? If you send notifications about migration to your internal team and external teams at the same time, customer success isn't going to like you. They're going to not be fans of you because you just made their job harder. Now they have to track down answers as their customers are asking them. Notify your internal users before your external users, even if you expect no downtime. Now, if you don't expect any downtime, this next step is optional. Notifying external users. If there's not going to be any downtime for external users, it's reasonable not to notify them. Why worry them if you are confident that it's not going to be down, right? This would be, normal incidents happen all the time. So if you don't expect it, then it's normal not to notify customers. But if you do expect downtime, it's good to let customers know at least a couple of weeks beforehand so that they can plan for their own redundancy, right? If you expect downtime, that may not be okay for them, right? In fact, for a lot of customers, it won't be, even the read-only downtime. So lives may depend on their applications running correctly. So you want to make sure you give them enough time to plan for that migration window so that they aren't down during it. They will appreciate it. So once you've got your external users notified, your internal users notified, your migration dry runs are primo, they're perfect. Now we're into the nitty gritty, the days before, right? 1 to 3 days before, that's when we're going to adjust TTLs, time to live. We're going to implement a code freeze, and we're going to move our code. Now, why do I say adjust TTLs 1 to 3 days before? A lot of hosts will automatically reduce your TTLs back to 12 hours after 72 hours or so. You want to understand the limits of your host in terms of how long they give you before they automatically reduce. Yes, this presentation will be available later. You want to make sure you want to understand your host's limits on TTLs, on time to live for DNS, so that you don't run into a situation where you change your TTLs a week in advance, but then migration day, you find out they're back to 12 or 24 hours, right? That's not a situation you want to be in. Understand your host and how they work with TTLs. And I would recommend only doing it a couple of days before, at least 1 day, because it can take up to 24 hours to propagate. Additionally, in this time period, you're going to implement your code freeze. Okay, why are you implementing your code freeze? Because you don't want to have a a difference between the stateless services on your old host and the stateless services on your new host, right? So when you implement this code freeze, right after that, you can start deploying your stateless services, those code services that we talked about earlier. You can start deploying those on the new host, no problem, right? Because now you're not going to have any difference between those and the old ones. But you have to have that code freeze in effect. Additionally, you are going to create your stateful services at this point. Now, they're not going to have the right state in them, but that's okay. We don't need them to have the right state in them right away. But we don't want to be spinning up the database as we're migrating the data to our new provider. That's going to extend our downtime window. So we want to have the database, say it's MySQL, we want to have that created in advance, even if it's empty, right? All that stuff happens in this 1 to 3 day window ahead of migration, okay? Okay. All right, moving code. Stateless services can be done at any point ahead of migration as long as the code freeze is in effect from that point until the migration is complete, right? We're not making any changes. What do I mean when I say code freeze? I mean your developers are not allowed to push changes, all right? They can work on stuff, sure, but no changes can be pushed to production until this migration is complete once a code freeze is in effect. You probably already do code freezes around major holidays or something like that because you're low staffed. This is just another one of those. The one piece of stateless services that you must change is connection strings, okay, which must point to the services at the new host. Now, I know you may think, oh, well, we're changing DNS anyway, so we can just use the same connection strings. Don't do that. You can't effectively test those connection strings until you've changed DNS, and you don't want to change DNS until you're actually migrating. So it's not a good idea to rely on DNS for this, because the DNS is in the end what we're relying on for our forward-facing customers. So we want to use different connection strings, different URLs, different DNS for these connection strings, for these database connection strings. All of your services have connection strings. Your developers know what they are. If you don't worry about it. So just make sure that's a key checklist item. All right, the migration. Yes, that's right. We haven't actually been talking about the migration itself up to this point. I'm sorry for that. Oh, and Ruben asked, are you automating the dry run with something like Terraform? Absolutely, you can, right? So Ruben asked about Terraform. Somebody else mentioned Ansible. Absolutely, you can use configuration management tools for this stuff. But you just have to make sure you're doing it, right? You don't trust the configuration management just to do it automatically. Don't say, hey, migration day, the configuration management will take care of it for us. You still have to go through the dry run. You still have to make sure it's working. Right, so Tim asks, what about simple apps? So let's go back to this one. What about simple apps where the connection string is often just localhost? That is not the type of app we're really focusing on moving today. That's more that's what we call a monolithic app, right? So that's an application where where everything is together on one machine. That's very difficult to do a live or read-only migration for, because everything is reliant on that one piece of physical hardware. So unless you split it up, it's tougher to do a monolithic migration like that. But absolutely, if you're migrating services which rely on stuff on the same host, you don't need to change those connection strings because they're going to remain on the same host. So great question, Tim. Thanks for that. So let's talk about the actual migration. We're going to go through the 4 phases in my mind of migration. And then I'm gonna have a list for you guys at the end that has all the phases listed out, including what isn't included in a dry run. So don't worry. So first phase, verify. This is critical. If you don't get through the verify phase successfully, don't move forward with migration. You're gonna first verify your lower DNS TTLs, that's domain name services, time to live, have propagated. I'm glad, Tim. I'm glad to hear that. Tim said that this is still a lot of applicable to migrated monolithic apps. I totally agree. It's just a little more complicated with monolithic apps because of the way that they work. So the verify phase, first we're going to verify lower TTLs have propagated. You can do this with a simple dig command. Just check the TTLs of certain things. You can use all sorts of online tools for this. Your developers should have general idea of how to verify a TTL, or just Google it. It's pretty easy to do. Second, you want to verify that your code, aka stateless services, aka immutable architecture, has been deployed successfully on the new host, right? It should be the same versions you have on the old host. It should all be standing up, all ready to start working, right? Your stateless services, there shouldn't be anything else you have to do to them except change the connection strings once they're deployed, right? They should be done. Then finally, on the verify phase, verify stateful services are ready to receive state on the new host. Like we talked about, you don't want to download your state from your existing service while it's read-only, and then start a MySQL cluster as you're trying to move the data into it. You want to have that MySQL cluster or database set up already, ready to receive data, so that you can you don't have to worry about that extra lead time in the migration. Second phase is adjust. This is the part where we're changing connection strings. We're making sure everything points to the right services on the new host. We don't care about the old host. That's still running right now, right? It's still running. We're not changing anything on the old host. We're changing only the infrastructure on the new host, making sure it all points to each other, not to the old services. If you have your application still trying to reach the database that's across the world from it, you're going to have problems. It's going to have significant issues immediately. So you don't want that. And you don't want to change your old infrastructure because you don't want the inverse problem until you finish the migration. So make sure that this is just on the new infrastructure that you're changing these connection strings. And in the code base. That's the second part. Now that we're still in a code freeze, we're not deploying changes to the old host. We want to change our code base to include the new connection strings so that any future deployments don't accidentally revert us to referring to an old architecture, right? That would be that would be very, very bad. We want to make sure that our code base has those new connection strings as well. Then we have the lift and shift phase. Okay, this is where this is the actual migration downtime period. All right, this is the start of when we have our read-only phase. Okay, so we're disabling writes on all stateful services first, and then we're in go mode after that because now services are down, quote unquote down, because they're only read-only. So as soon as we disable writes on stateful services, we take a download of the current state from the old host, right? We're taking all of that state, all the data from the database, and we're downloading it. And then we're taking it and uploading it to that new host, okay? Now, when that happens, after that data is uploaded to the new host, those two databases on the old host and the new host should be identical, right? They should be exactly the same in terms of their data because no changes were made to the old host between the time it was downloaded and the time that it was uploaded, okay? Once that's done, you're going to perform testing. I know everybody gets all excited. Hey, we got it over there. It should work now. Let's just turn it on. Let's change DNS right away. No, resist that urge. Perform your unit testing, just like you did in your dry run phase. Perform unit tests to make sure everything performs as expected. Make sure that you're not calling back to old data centers with your code. This is a critical step. If you don't do this, and you have problems, you only have yourself to blame. Please perform those final verification tests. I know you're antsy to start up the new infrastructure. Perform those final tests first. And then once you've got successful tests, point your DNS to your new host. And then you re-enable writes. Once you've given it about a minute for those DNS changes to propagate, you're going to re-enable writes on the new host, and suddenly all of your traffic is on your new host. You are fully functional. This is the completion of the migration. Okay. Now there's one more thing I want to talk about here, which we haven't touched on specifically yet, which is the rollback plan. At every stage of the migration, each one of those phases we went through, you must understand how to get back to where you were before. right? You could always have something unanticipated happen, and you have to have that insurance that you understand, hey, how do we roll back from this point? If you don't have a rollback plan, again, and something goes wrong, you only have yourself to blame. You must have a rollback plan for each one of these phases. And that's why I wanted to give you all these phases, okay? This is your checklist, okay? This is the one page I want you guys to get out of this entire presentation. And I know it's not the prettiest slide I've ever made, but it's because I just wanted to get information out onto this page. These are the phases of a migration. The underlined steps are the ones not taken during a dry run. So every other one of these phases is pardon me, I had to get a drink. Every other one of these phases is critical for a dry run, but the underlying phases you don't want to do unless you're actually performing the final migration, right? That obviously they are things like disabling rights and changing connection strings in your code base. So all of these other phases should be done during a dry run. And in general, this is the checklist you should look at. This is the checklist you should be thinking of on the day of migration. All of this stuff should be happening. Obviously, for your application, they're going to be more complex little checklist items here, right? The changing connection strings should be change connection strings here and here and here. The verify lower TTLs should give you a list of the DNS host names that you should be verifying. You can build out more into this list, but this is the skeleton you should be using. Okay. And that's pretty much it. That's the message I wanted to get across to everybody is essentially this. How do you verify that? Good question. So Napoleon asked, how do you verify the TTLs, for example? So verifying TTLs can be done with a simple dig against a URL. You can you can Google, how do I check my TTL, my DNS TTL, which is domain name service time to live. So how you verify that is you turn, so Napoleon asked another question and said, how do you verify the new server has an exact copy of the old database? There are ways you can do that with a hash, for example, but that's not really important. How you verify that is you turn off writes before you do any downloads, right? Before you take any state, you make sure that that server doesn't allow changes. That database does not allow changes, right? Because then any changes which get through shouldn't have gotten through anyway. So it doesn't matter if they got through because they wouldn't get through. But the point is you verify that by planning ahead of time and understanding exactly how to turn off writes for your infrastructure. P. Wagner asked, will there be a talk about moving monolithic applications? Any talk, good question. Any talk I would give about moving monolithic applications would be fundamentally to recommend that they be tiered, right? So yes, we can talk about moving monolithic migrations, but most of it's going to be a talk about how we taking things offline, right? Which isn't the ideal way to migrate a site. Yes, you can do an online migration for a monolithic application, but it's more difficult because of the way things are interlocked and the way they tie together. So that's one of the reasons I have actually a previous tech talk that you can look up that talks about how to break your monolithic architecture into a simple 3-tier architecture that's more robust, it's more reliable, it's more fault tolerant, it's easier to manage, and it's easier to migrate, right? So that would be my fundamental recommendation there. But great question. Any other questions? Anybody? Oh, I should say, Waleed asked, what amount of the dry run can be automated? Should it be completely automated? Absolutely. Sure. The actual migration process of the dry run can be completely automated, and the migration itself can be automated if that's the way you did the dry runs. What's important is that you're performing the unit tests afterwards to verify that everything works exactly as expected. Yeah, no problem, Wagner. Happy to help. So Get Profit asked, is an actual no downtime live migration even possible? I wouldn't qualify having a read-only database as completely live. Yes, it's possible. It requires a multi-master database, essentially, which is possible, which exists. That's why I say it depends on the stack that you have. Because if you have a multi-master capable database or you have that configured already, then absolutely you can perform a zero downtime migration. Essentially, that's the state that you have to worry about, is that database. So not typically get profit, just to answer your question. Yeah, it's not common to be able to do a completely no downtime migration, but it is possible under certain circumstances. But great question. Any other questions? Good questions from everybody. I really appreciate the participation in chat. We have more time. If you guys want to dive into one of the slides in particular, I'd love to. Just let me know. Yeah, so Wagner indicated he's talking about symmetric DS for multi-master databases. Absolutely, there are certainly tools that can provide a multi-master database, and that's something that if you can implement it, I strongly encourage. Not only does it provide you increased reliability, but it provides you much more flexibility in terms of where your infrastructure is located. One of the reasons I think migrations like this are important is, like I said before, at DigitalOcean, we recommend customers are multi-cloud. We recommend you have some sort of DR policy like that, and being able to migrate quickly and easily between clouds and having a presence on multiple clouds allows you to choose what's most cost effective, what's most secure, what's the best fit for you right now in terms of features. And that's why I think it's important to understand migration procedures and have a plan in place. Bradley asked, what's your view on Terraform for provisioning the environment versus using DOCLI? So it's actually DocTel, DOCTL, but that's what I believe Bradley was referring to. So either one is a perfectly good option. And this is something I'm going to come back to again and again. It depends on what your team is comfortable with. Always, it depends on what your team is comfortable with. If your team is a C shop, you're not going to have them code in JavaScript. If they are comfortable with Doctel, why break out Terraform just to have them do that one thing, right? You can absolutely script with Doctel or DLCTL, and it's a perfectly good tool for standing up infrastructure, specifically on DigitalOcean. Why Terraform is good? It's multi-cloud, right? Doctel obviously focuses on DigitalOcean. The AWS CLI focuses on AWS. Terraform is multi-cloud, right? So that's one reason it's better for migrations between clouds. Neuroman, sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. He asked, what kind of tools do you usually use for performance testing on the new host? There are a couple that I like. So performance testing specifically, again, not talking about unit testing, but performance testing. I like Pingdom and GTmetrix. Those are a couple of free tools that give you great information in terms of how your site is performing. Those are more optimization tools than performance testing. Another one is loader.io. That's a great one for just determining raw requests, right? So loader.io will just start to send more and more requests to your service and measure the performance as it does that. So that's great for raw performance testing. GTmetrix for more optimization type performance testing, and Pingdom is sort of a mix between the two. But great question. Great question. Good to see you from Sierra Leone. Also a first for me, having a participant from Sierra Leone. Very nice to meet you. Ariane asks how the performance of the app can be affected by the architecture. A lot, right? So when we talk about the architecture, we're talking about the way in which things are designed. We're talking about, if we look at this, sorry to go back so far. If we look at this diagram, this is the architecture, right? The way things fit together, the way that they communicate with each other. And as I talked about before, a tiered architecture where things are separated out and sequestered into their own services is my recommendation for the way the way to go for various reasons. I have another tech talk, which is specifically about how to take a monolithic application and break it into a tiered architecture, which is, I believe, superior for multiple reasons. One, reliability. You are more reliable because you can horizontally scale, so individual components can fall. You are fault tolerant. You are more scalable because you can scale individual components instead of having to scale the entire server. I think everybody's aware that when you scale a server, you're not scaling 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte, 3 gigabyte, 4 gigabyte. You're scaling 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Right? That's the typical way that these server sizes scale. So if you have everything on one server, sometimes you have to make a huge jump in cost just for a small performance requirement. If you have them separated out, not only does it improve your performance overall, but it allows you to scale things independently, which gives you much more control over your costs and your performance. Additionally, like I said, this whole migration thing is much easier if you're in a tiered architecture already than it is if you're in a monolithic setup. And Lucas Materna asked, is there a way to easily migrate complete server from other providers to DigitalOcean without need of installing server from zero, only stateless content? So if it's entirely stateless content, so that's an interesting question, Lucas. I'm not sure if I fully understand your question. But yes, when you say without need of installing server from zero, you can absolutely start with a one-click application, for instance. So for example, if you have a WordPress application, but it's completely stateless, right? So you aren't allowing any input from customers or anything like that. If you have a WordPress blog or a Ghost blog or something like that, you can stand up a duplication, a new one-click application of WordPress or Ghost or whatever on your new provider, and then use one of those migration-specific tools, right? So WordPress, for example, has a lot of plugins that will help with migration. Other tools have migration suites that allow you to migrate the entire thing over. But generally, I'm not sure if that answers your question, Lucas. But yes, it is possible without having to install everything yourself, depending on your application. So Cyber Norris asks, this assumes that blocking writes is not downtime, but it may really be in some critical applications, in which case you may as well do planned downtime. Where does this plan fit in such a scenario? So that's a good question. This is actually something we talked about on this slide, right? So it's not that a read-only migration is a no downtime migration. It's that it's a no quote unquote downtime migration, right? So this is obviously a cheeky way to describe it, but essentially what I mean by that, Cybernurus, is that a read-only migration in many cases can allow your customers to continue to use many functions of your application, even if they can't write new data or you can't create new customers, right? So it's a good idea to I like to, like I said before, when planning a migration, I like to have it on a Tuesday early in the morning, right? Very early in the morning, get people out of bed early. That way, if there are problems throughout the day, you can fix them. But because it's so early in the morning, your customers aren't necessarily at a peak time yet using your site. So that's my ideal time for migration, is like crack of dawn, 4 a.m., get people up early, let them go home right after the migration's done. And that way you have the rest of the week. It's not a Monday, so people aren't hungover, but it's also not a Friday, so people aren't getting ready to go for the weekend. So Tuesday, early in the morning, that's when I like to do migrations. I hope that answered your question, Cybernurus. And then Fall asked why use snapshot on my droplet in DigitalOcean. I think you're talking about potentially migrating with snapshots. Snapshot migrations are possible within DigitalOcean, but you can't currently download those snapshots. And even if you could, it's difficult to say you could stand them up successfully on another service, right? So other clouds don't necessarily mix with the tools of other clouds. So a snapshot from one cloud provider, even if you can download it, won't necessarily stand up as you'd expect on another cloud provider. So I recommend not using those proprietary tools and instead using your own tooling. I hope that answers your question, Fall. But great. I think that's all the questions I see. But we're close to time anyway, so that's good timing. I really appreciate everyone popping in and and talking in chat. This was a great webinar. One of my favorites that I've done. So I really appreciate it. Just one more question here. Well, so first of all, I want to say any further questions, you guys can always reach out to me at dwilkin@digitalocean.com. But also, we have a wonderful sales team that can answer all sorts of questions. We handle migrations all the time. do.co/sales is a great place to ask. Bradley had one more question. I'll go ahead and hit real quick. Will you ever have the ability to download snapshots for offline storage? I'm going to give you a strong maybe on that, Bradley. It's something we've wanted for a little while, and I certainly hope we can implement it soon. But I can't confirm or deny any rumors of the ability to download snapshots for offline storage at this time. But good question. Phil asked, any comments on how to build apps that are easier to migrate? Yes, I have another tech talk, which I can't recall the name of off the top of my head, but it's essentially about how to take a monolithic app and split it into a tiered architecture, which is the ideal way to build for if you want to migrate in the future. So a tiered architecture is the way to go, and I have another tech talk on that. Maybe I'll give it another point in the future, and you can attend that one. Yeah, Get Profit. Happy to do a European-friendly time slot. We have a ton of customers in Europe and also a ton of employees in Europe for DigitalOcean, team members of mine that I work with every day. So I absolutely love to have it in a time slot that's convenient for Europe. I know this isn't a great time slot for India, but unfortunately we can't make a perfect time slot for everyone all the time. But this has been great to talk to you folks. I do hope to hear from some of you. Reach out to that URL. We have a form there, or email me directly, dwilkin or Darian at digitalocean.com. I'm always happy to answer questions. It doesn't have to be for business. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and it was great talking to you all.